The autumn leaves danced outside the dining room window like fragments of broken dreams, casting shifting shadows across the Hartwell family's dinner table. Emma sat quietly in her usual corner, fork moving mechanically through her mashed potatoes while the conversation flowed around her like a river she could never quite enter. "Lucas, sweetheart, you've barely touched your vegetables," Clara cooed, her voice honeyed with maternal warmth that never quite reached Emma's ears. The 14-year-old watched as her stepmother leaned over to cut her 6-year-old half-brother's chicken into perfect, bite-sized pieces. "I don't like broccoli," Lucas whined, pushing the green florets around his plate with theatrical disgust. "That's perfectly fine, darling. Emma, would you mind taking Lucas's vegetables? We can't waste food in this house." Clara's smile was radiant as she turned toward Emma, but there was something crystalline in her blue eyes, beautiful and sharp enough to cut. Emma's father, David, looked up from his phone where he'd been scrolling through work emails. "Clara's right, Em. Clean your plate." "But Dad, I already finished mine," Emma began, gesturing to her empty dish. "Don't argue with your mother," David said absently, his attention already drifting back to his screen. The word mother hung in the air like a discordant note. Clara wasn't her mother, would never be her mother, but correcting this seemed to require more energy than Emma possessed. She reached across the table and scraped Lucas's rejected vegetables onto her own plate, the small mound of broccoli looking like a miniature forest of disappointment. Clara's smile widened. "Such a good girl, always so helpful." But Emma caught the fleeting expression that crossed her stepmother's face when David wasn't looking. A flash of something cold and calculating, like a cat watching a mouse it planned to toy with before the kill. Later that evening, as Emma washed the dishes alone while Clara helped Lucas with his bath, she stared out the kitchen window at her reflection superimposed against the darkening sky. 2 years had passed since her father remarried. 2 years of walking on eggshells and swallowing words that tasted like ashes. Her real mother's photograph had mysteriously disappeared from the mantelpiece shortly after the wedding, replaced by a family portrait where Emma stood slightly apart from the others, as if the camera had captured what her heart already knew. She was becoming a ghost in her own home. The soapy water grew cold around her hands as she scrubbed the same plate over and over, lost in thought. Outside, a lone streetlight flickered like a dying star, and Emma wondered if anyone would notice if she simply faded away entirely. The transformation was gradual, like ice forming on a pond, imperceptible at first, then suddenly complete and unbreakable. Over the following months, Clara's campaign against Emma intensified with the methodical precision of a master strategist. "Emma, darling," Clara would say, her voice syrupy with false concern. "I found mud tracked through the house again. I know you're at that difficult age, but we really must be more careful about these things." Emma would stare at the pristine carpet, seeing no mud, knowing that Lucas had run through the house in his soccer cleats just an hour before. But when she opened her mouth to protest, Clara would tilt her head with that practiced expression of wounded disappointment. "I'm not angry, sweet girl. I know you're still adjusting to having a real family again. It's only natural that you'd act out sometimes." The phrase "real family" always landed like a slap, precise and stinging. Emma learned to absorb these moments in silence, her internal landscape growing more desolate with each passing day. David, consumed by his expanding business and his new wife's constant subtle manipulations, grew increasingly distant from his daughter. Clara was an artist in her craft, never cruel when David was fully present, always nurturing just enough in public to maintain her reputation as the devoted stepmother. But in the spaces between his attention, she chipped away at Emma's place in the family like water wearing away stone. The chores multiplied. Emma found herself responsible for Lucas's laundry, his room, his forgotten homework. When she struggled to keep up with her own schoolwork, Clara would sigh dramatically. "I worry about Emma's priorities, David. She seems to be falling behind in her responsibilities at home. Perhaps we need to consider whether she's mature enough for the privileges she's been given." One by one, those privileges vanished. Her allowance was redirected to Lucas's savings account for his future. Her weekend plans were canceled because family comes first. Her friends stopped calling when she had to decline invitation after invitation. The final blow came on a gray February morning when Clara methodically packing her belongings into cardboard boxes. "What are you doing?" Emma's voice cracked like thin ice. Clara looked up with an expression of practiced surprise. "Oh, honey, your father and I have been talking and we think it might be best if you went to live with your Aunt Margaret for a while, just until things settled down here." Emma's aunt lived 3 states away. She was kind but distant, a spinster who viewed children as mysterious creatures she'd had no idea how to manage. Dad agreed to this. "He's very concerned about your behavior lately, sweetheart. The lying, the laziness, the way you've been treating Lucas. He thinks a change of environment might help you find yourself." But Emma hadn't been lying. She'd been taking the blame for Lucas's mischief because Clara always ensured the evidence pointed to her. She hadn't been lazy. She'd been drowning under the weight of unrealistic expectations. And she'd never been anything but gentle with Lucas, even as he learned to weaponize his mother's favoritism. The trap was perfect, and Emma realized with crystalline clarity that Clara had been building toward this moment for months. Every small manipulation, every shifted blame, every stolen moment of her father's attention had led here. That evening, Clara made her final move. As the family gathered for dinner, she discovered her grandmother's antique brooch, a family heirloom worth several $1,000s, hidden in Emma's backpack. "I can't believe this," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with perfectly performed shock. "Emma, how could you—" David's face went white, then flushed with anger. "Emma, is this true?" "No, Dad, I've never seen that before. I would never—" "The evidence is right there, David," Clara said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I've tried so hard to be patient, to be understanding, but I can't have a thief in our home, not with Lucas to think about." Emma watched her father's face close off, like a door slamming shut. In that moment, she understood that the battle was over, had perhaps been over before it truly began. Clara held all the cards. David's love, his trust, his need to believe in the perfect family they'd created. But as Emma sat there, watching her world collapse around her, something unexpected happened. Instead of the despair she'd expected to feel, a strange calm settled over her. She looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw not a formidable enemy, but a woman so insecure, so desperate for control that she would destroy a child to get it. "I didn't take your brooch," Emma said quietly, her voice steady. The simplicity of her response seemed to unsettle Clara more than any protestation of innocence could have. David, however, was already beyond reason. "Pack your things, Emma. I'll call Margaret tonight." As Emma climbed the stairs to her room, soon to be empty, she felt something shift inside her chest. The desperate need for her father's approval, Clara's acceptance, Lucas's brotherly affection, all of it began to fall away like leaves in autumn. She was 14 years old and she was learning the hardest lesson of her young life. Sometimes love isn't enough, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you most need protection from. But she was also learning something else, something that would serve her well in the years to come. She was stronger than she'd known, more resilient than they'd counted on. Clara might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. 12 years passed like season changing, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum until Emma barely recognized the frightened girl she'd once been. At 26, she stood in the marble lobby of her law firm's building, her reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces around her. The scared, silent child had grown into a woman of quiet strength and purposeful grace. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, piercing through the comfortable routine of her successful life like an alarm bell. "Emma? It's Dad." David's voice was older, threadbare with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. Emma set down her pen and leaned back in her leather chair, looking out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Hello, Dad. I need to see you. We need to see you. Lucas and we're in trouble, Em. Real trouble." The story emerged in broken fragments over the course of their conversation. After Emma had left, Clara's true nature had gradually revealed itself. Without the convenient scapegoat of her daughter, David had slowly begun to see the patterns of manipulation and control that defined his wife's character. But by then, it was too late. Lucas had been thoroughly corrupted by years of unlimited indulgence and protection from consequences. Clara had left 5 years ago, abandoning her family when Lucas's gambling debts and drug problems became too much to manage. She'd taken half of David's assets and disappeared, leaving behind only a note about needing to find herself. Lucas, now 23, had cycled through rehab programs in failed business ventures with the determination of someone who'd never learned that actions have consequences. His latest scheme, a cryptocurrency investment that was actually an elaborate Ponzi scheme, had left David facing bankruptcy and potential criminal charges. "I know I have no right to ask, but you're the only family we have left. The only one who ever had her head on straight." Emma closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of family obligations settling across her shoulders like a familiar coat. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to hang up the phone and let them face the consequences of their choices. She had built a good life, free from the toxicity that had defined her adolescence. But as she sat there in her pristine office, Emma found herself thinking about the scared little boy Lucas had once been before Clara's poisonous influence had twisted him into someone she barely recognized. She thought about her father, flawed and weak, but not fundamentally evil, now facing the ruins of the life he'd chosen over his daughter's well-being. Most of all, she thought about the woman she'd become, not in spite of their treatment, but because of it. Their betrayal had taught her independence. Their abandonment had shown her the value of true loyalty. Their cruelty had revealed the power of genuine kindness. "I'll be there this weekend," she heard herself saying. The flight home felt like traveling backward through time. Emma rented a car at the airport and drove through neighborhoods that looked smaller and shabbier than her childhood memories had painted them. The house she'd grown up in was still standing, but it wore neglect like an ill-fitting garment. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown, the cheerful facade that Clara had maintained now faded to gray disappointment. David met her at the door, and Emma was shocked by how much he'd aged. His hair had gone completely white, his frame stooped with the weight of accumulated regrets. But it was his eyes that broke my heart. They held a depth of sorrow that seemed to acknowledge every mistake, every moment of willful blindness, every time he'd chosen convenience over truth. "Emma," he whispered, and she could hear a lifetime of apologies in the way he spoke her name. Lucas appeared behind him, and the transformation was even more jarring. The spoiled child had become a hollow-eyed man, his face bearing the telltale signs of someone who'd run out of second chances. But when he saw Emma, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of the brother he might have been in different circumstances. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in their lives, the words sounded genuine. "I'm so fucking sorry, Em." Over the following weeks, Emma worked with quiet efficiency to untangle the legal and financial mess that had become her family's legacy. She hired lawyers, negotiated with creditors, and used her own savings to keep David from losing the house entirely. But more than that, she found herself doing something she'd never expected, helping Lucas find a path toward redemption. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and arguments, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. Lucas struggled with sobriety and the alien concept of personal responsibility. David grappled with the magnitude of his failures as a father and husband, and Emma wrestled with the complex alchemy of forgiveness, not the cheap kind that pretends wounds don't exist, but the harder variety that acknowledges pain while choosing grace. The breakthrough came one evening as they sat around the same dinner table where it had all begun. Lucas had been sober for 2 months, was working at a local hardware store, and for the first time in years seemed to be building something resembling a real life. "I used to hate you," he said suddenly, looking across the table at Emma. "When we were kids, Mom, Clara, she always made it seem like everything would be perfect if you just weren't here anymore." Emma nodded, not unsurprised. She'd sensed Clara's influence in every cruel word, every act of casual cruelty Lucas had directed her way. "But you know what's fucked up?" Lucas continued, his voice growing stronger. "After you left, it wasn't perfect. It was worse, because without you there to blame, we had to look at ourselves, and we were horrible people." David reached across the table and took Emma's hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He said, "I failed you. I was supposed to protect you, and instead I let her poison our family. I let her drive away the best thing in my life." Emma felt tears she hadn't expected sliding down her cheeks. Not tears of pain, she'd shed those years ago, but tears of something more complex. Relief, perhaps. Recognition. The acknowledgement that the love she'd always hoped existed beneath the dysfunction had been real, just buried under layers of manipulation and fear. "We can't go back," she said gently, "but we can go forward if you want to." The healing wasn't instant or complete. There were still difficult conversations, still moments of frustration and disappointment. Clara occasionally called, usually when she needed money, her voice still carrying that familiar note of manipulative sweetness. But each time, David hung up a little faster, his boundaries a little clearer. Lucas enrolled in community college and discovered an aptitude for engineering that surprised them all. David slowly began to rebuild his business, this time with Emma's guidance and a hard-won understanding of the difference between enabling and supporting. And Emma? She found herself learning the most surprising lesson of all, that forgiveness wasn't a gift she gave to them, but a freedom she claimed for herself. The bitter child who'd left this house 12 years ago had been carrying the weight of their betrayal like stones in her pockets. By choosing to help them, not because they deserved it, but because she was capable of it, she finally set down that burden. The last scene took place almost exactly where the first had begun, around the dinner table, as autumn painted the windows in shades of gold and crimson. But this time, when Lucas reached for his vegetables without being asked, when David put away his phone to focus on the conversation, and Emma felt the warm circle of genuine family love surrounding her like a blanket, she understood that some stories have endings worth waiting for. Clara was absent from this tableau, living alone in a distant city, still seeking the happiness that had always eluded her because she'd never learned the difference between taking and receiving. In choosing cruelty over compassion, control over connection, she'd written herself out of the very story she'd tried so hard to dominate. But for the three people gathered around this simple table, sharing a meal and tentative hope for the future, Clara's absence felt less like a wound and more like the natural consequence of choices made long ago. They had found their way back to each other, not through forgetting the past, but by transforming it into wisdom. As Emma looked at her father and brother, flawed, scarred, but genuinely trying, she realized that sometimes the greatest victory isn't avoiding the battle entirely, but emerging from it with your capacity for love intact. The cruel stepmother had tried to destroy their family, but in the end, she had only made them stronger, more grateful for the bonds that truly matter. Outside, the wind scattered the last of the autumn leaves, making room for whatever season would come next.